Welcome! Today you will learn about two menacing Tyrannid Hive fleets, Dagon and Gorgon, which are ravaging the galaxy. Hive Fleet Dagon. The Tyrannid swarm must not be viewed as a foe set to destroy us, but as a tool. Our challenge is to learn to use that tool, so that it may not be used against the Imperium, but rather to assist the Imperium in fulfilling our manifest destiny. Inquisitor Yvain Cartier. Hive Fleet Dagon was the first major Tyrannid incursion into the Jericho Reach region of the Ultima Segmentum. The shadow in the warp cast by the Tyrannid hive mind within this volatile region of space first heralded the arrival of this new and terrible hive fleet in the year 812 of the 41st millennium. Communication between parts of the Achilles Crusade and the reconquered regions of the Jericho Reach was lost without warning. Particularly affected was the Orpheus salient of the Crusade that was lost to communication and access with the rest of the Reach behind the Hive Fleet's crawling warp interference. In the year 814 of the 41st millennium, the Deathwatch warship Thunder's Word entered the Freya system to investigate the silence of an astropathic relay. It found no trace of the relay, and indeed no trace of any life in the Freya system. Preparing to leave the system, the Thunder's Word encountered two Tyrannid Vanguard drone ships. Its hull scored and pitted with acid, and its magazines nearly exhausted, the Thunder's Word arrived at Watch Fortress Eriok, bringing news that the Tyrannids had come to the Jericho Reach. The Tyrannid Hive Fleet that is assaulting the Jericho Reach is officially designated by the Imperium as Hive Fleet Dagon, and has been identified as the greatest extant threat to the Achilles Crusade underway in the region, and indeed to the lives of every living being in the Jericho Reach. The Space Marines of the Deathwatch remain fully engaged in facing this threat. Not much is known about the origins of Hive Fleet Dagon, other than that it hails from the edge of the galactic rim, far to the galactic east, like all of the Tyrannid Hive fleets that have been encountered to date. It is suspected by the Imperial scholars of the Ordo Xenos with a high degree of confidence that this particular Hive fleet may be a splinter of the decimated Hive Fleet Behemoth, which was destroyed during the First Tyrannic War in the year 745 of the 41st millennium by Imperial forces at the Battle of Macragge. This new Hive fleet brings many all too familiar horrors to the Jericho Reach. Alongside the familiar, however, come new and disturbing Tyrannid variations, proving once again that as soon as the Imperium believes it understands the Tyrannid, that hideous species changes and adapts once more. For the Jericho Reach, the arrival of the Great Devourer was a mighty hammer blow, catching the Achilles Crusade off balance and forcing Imperial commanders to scramble to face this new threat before too much ground was lost and too many worlds had fallen. Meeting the swarms head-on, millions died in those first desperate standard years after Dagon's arrival, and many planets could not be saved. They disappeared forever under a rising and bloody tide of razor-sharp claws and clacking mandibles. Commanders and Imperial soldiers alike came to know the signs and character of the swarm, the nature of its beasts and the unique hunger it seemed to possess for the Jericho Reach, as if it had a special taste for that sector's worlds. They also noted how it adapted and changed with each world it consumed, each battle it won or lost. This kind of rapid adaptation had been observed in other Tyrannid Hive fleets, but in Hive Fleet Dagon it seemed as if the fleet were aware of the pain and suffering it was inflicting and the terror in the hearts of the soldiers trying to stop it. In the space of a few short standard years, this evolution and mutation within Hive Fleet Dagon led to a number of unique bioconstructs and weapons never seen before by Imperial Xenos scholars, the most terrible of them all being the Dagon Overlord. The Achilles Crusade's forces within the Orpheus salient were already stretched far too thinly to be effective defenders. As the Crusade scrambled to try to find reinforcements, the Tyrannid swarm moved ever deeper into the Reach. This left the Deathwatch as the only force capable of assuming responsibility for defending against the Xenos incursion. By observing different star systems and selectively choosing their targets to maximize their small but potent forces available in the Reach, the Deathwatch valiantly attempted to blunt or even halt the Tyrannid attack. Whether this strategy will prove successful or not remains to be seen. History. First encounter. The earliest encounters with what would eventually be designated Hive Fleet Dagon went almost entirely unnoticed by the Aculus Crusade High Command. The first tyrannid bioforms encountered were Gin-Stealer hybrids, and the members of the planet's enforcers that destroyed them thought them to be merely hideously deformed human mutants. It was not until an encounter with a full-scale infestation on the death world of Herisor that word of a new Xenos threat reached the ears of the leadership of the Crusade. Slightly over a standard year later, Battle Group Argo returned to Herisor to find the landscape completely changed, and no sign of the pioneers or the members of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Once again, the forces of the Astra Militarum's Iaxian Tithe Guard, in this case the Iaxian 7th Regiment, were sent down to the surface to investigate what happened. Once they had made planetfall, the soldiers who had been there previously were stunned to find that in place of a barren wasteland was now a mighty tundra that stretched as far as the eye could see. The commander of the Iaxian Tithe Guard complement sent out scout patrols in all directions to attempt to find some trace of the missing group of Imperials. For the first solar hour or so, all was normal. No sign of the previous landing group, but nothing to indicate what happened to them. That's when all communication was lost, except for one broken transmission. The commander of the Iaxian Guardsmen had his communication officer relay a message to the fleet in orbit, along with his plans for dealing with this new menace on the planet's surface. Receiving an acknowledgement from command, he proceeded to carry out his mission. The Iaxians were never heard from again. The Death Watch arrive. After receiving the foreboding message from the Iaxian 7th Regiment, Lord General Michael Curus deployed Battle Group Cerberus under the command of Lord Admiral Anastasia Archelius back through the shadow in the warp. Her task was to send a message directly to Lord Militant Solomon Tetrarchus and any officer of the Adeptus Astartes regarding this new and terrible threat. Battle Group Cerberus immediately departed back towards the Iron Collar at all possible speed. The ship stopped once, for their navigator to realign himself with the Astronomicon, and during this brief stopover they encountered the strike cruiser Belleron. Seeing it was a Space Marine void ship, Admiral Archelius transmitted the message to them, then proceeded on towards her original goal. What she did not realize was that the strike cruiser Belleron was currently under extended secondment to the Ordo Xenos to transport the Deathwatch to new locations within the Acheros salient. Hearing the message, Inquisitor Gent had the captain of the vessel come to a new heading. The Deathwatch headed directly to Herisor. This new information had to be confirmed with all possible speed. If the Tyrannids had indeed come to the Jericho Reach, then there were now more pressing matters to deal with than the recent surges in Tau activity around the Black Reef. Before there was any Deathwatch intervention, 50 Astartes of the Storm Wardens chapter fought to stop the Tyrannids, or at least slow their advance on Herisor. Eventually, the Deathwatch was sent to aid the Storm Wardens' operations on the planet. When the Deathwatch arrived at Herisor, they deployed in numbers more akin to a typical Codex Astartes planetary siege than the usual small kill team deployment. More than 50 Deathwatch Space Marines deployed to the surface that day. They fought a campaign that lasted nearly 6 solar months until they were convinced that the menace was ended. The Deathwatch aided the Storm Wardens with surgical strikes on Tyrannid spore chimneys and synapse creatures with the support of the strike cruiser Belleron in orbit. From status reports, Inquisitor Gent became increasingly concerned when he noted that the Tyrannids were holding the chapel of St. Auret and the city surrounding it hostage. He assumed they were attracted to a relic or something else present in the area, radiating a psychic signature. The campaign ground on for solar months, and every opportunity was taken to prevent the Tyrannid swarm from reaching critical mass. Gent decided to send a Deathwatch kill team along with one of his trusted acolytes to survey the chapel and recover whatever relics resided within. The kill team, designated Lux Veritatis, reached the chapel and reported the discovery of an imperial relic of great power. Soon after, they were overrun by the Tyrannids and called for an orbital bombardment of the area. All contact with the Deathwatch team was subsequently lost. The Lux Veritatis was later presumed dead after flyby reconnaissance reports noted the remains of armour similar to theirs and that of the Inquisitor's acolyte strewn about the battle site. After the end of the campaign, when the Tyrannid menace had been defeated, Inquisitor Ghent had the planet declared a death world to ward off any who would be greedy enough to attempt harvesting its natural resources. Of the original 50 Deathwatch Astartes deployed to Herisor, only 20 made it back alive. At the same time that the Deathwatch were attacking the Tyrannid force on Herisor, word of this new threat had reached Lord Militant Solomon Tetrarchus. He quickly requested the battle barge Bloodsword to investigate where these creatures had come from. By tracing a line amongst the stable warp routes, the navigators aboard the Bloodsword came upon what may have been the first planet infected by the Tyrannid swarm within the Jericho Reach. It took 3 long solar months of warp travel before the Astartes of the Bloodsword were able to set foot on the planet that was once known as Xanatov's Harbour. Xanatov's Harbour. Xanatov's Harbour was named for the legendary rogue trader Corsair Captain Xanatov. This planet was one he frequented on his trade runs coming in from the eastern fringe of the galaxy. At one point it boasted excellent void ship repair facilities, and the lack of contact with the Imperium made an excellent place for smugglers and other members of the so-called cold trade, with Xenos to meet up and swap goods. This all changed at the end of the year 812 of the 41st millennium. Early reports recovered after the fact state that many people saw what they believed to be a meteor shower in the night sky. No one thought much of it, as a meteor shower is often a good omen for void ship captains. Slowly the reports began to filter in. These were no mere meteorites that had hit the ground, but instead housed a more sinister cargo of Tyrannid bioforms and reconnaissance organisms. The merchants and crew on the surface put up a decent fight, but were utterly outmatched by the lethal organic killing machines. Some managed to make their way to their void ships, but found that larger organisms were floating through the void, firing caustic projectiles of a biomechanical nature. None survived the onslaught of the ravenous beasts. All that were on planet were devoured, their genetic patterns added to the primordial soup that comprises Hive Fleet Dagon's gene pool. Ships in orbit were left abandoned. Most had had their hulls ruptured in hundreds of places by Tyrannid biospores attaching to the hull that ate their way inside. Any ships not completely wrecked were now floating abattoirs, a sickening testament to the utter brutality of a Tyrannid swarm on the warpath. So it was that Brother Captain Christoph and his company of Templars of Blood Astartes made their way to this graveyard of a planet. They expected to have to use the battle barge's bombardment cannons to clear the way of Tyrannid vessels and then deploy Thunderhawk gunships, as they would not be able to get close enough to use drop pods. What they actually encountered was something far worse. When the Bloodsword translated back into real space, it found nothing but a dead planet. Every bit of biological material had been stripped bare from the planet's surface. Setting down in their Thunderhawks, the Templars of Blood began a thorough search of the planet for any clue as to how the massive Hive fleet had arrived in the Jericho Reach. Realizing that he could not take a full battle company off of the front lines, Brother Captain Christoph left behind a small contingent of his available Space Marines to continue the investigation. Currently, there has been no communication from the Space Marines left behind that day, but the commanders of the Orpheus Salient still hold out hope that someday there will be news that can help them turn the tide of this war. Turning of the tide. Backed into a corner by the ever-encroaching swarm of Tyrannids, the Astra Militarum forces in the region began to retreat towards the Iron Collar. Lord Commissar Vance Theron and General Darian Archelius pulled almost all of the guardsmen who were not already engaged with the Tyrannids back to the feral world of Treyen. Here, they determined, was their line in the proverbial sand. They would fall back no further, and they would either die to the man or push the foul Xenos back into the warp from whence they came, Treyen. A largely temperate world, Treyen's population is centered primarily in its western hemisphere. The last imperial census had the population at roughly 250,000, with an average technology level equivalent to that of the Terran Bronze Age, common for a feral world. The primary star within the system is entering into its last stages of life, and as such, solar flares are beginning to spread a blanket of radiation around the planet. This has a nasty habit of causing long-range Vox transmissions to be unreliable at best, but it also seems to have an equal effect upon the psychic communications of the Tyranids on planet. Trajan was chosen as a suitable battleground by the leaders of the Orpheus Salient for these specific peculiarities. When the Achelous Crusade first encountered the planet Trajan, it was found that the human natives there worshipped their sun as a god. While this deity provided them with warmth, he could also bring terrible vengeance upon them when he was angered. The ecclesiarchy had little trouble in slightly altering the perceptions of the natives so that the god-emperor of mankind was seen in the same light as their false sun god. He would provide them with warmth, shelter, food, and protection. But if they ever angered him or his chosen representative, he would strike down upon them with a furious anger, the likes of which they had never seen before. While the Departamento Munitorum was attempting to calculate what the planet's tithe grading would be, it was discovered by an adventurous group of Astra Militarum guardsmen that the large native beasts had a unique pelt that, when skinned, had the ability to change coloration with the lighting. With this discovery, the planet's primary export was quickly changed, from baseline foodstuffs to luxury goods. Rumour has it that General Darian Archelius himself has his crusade dress uniform made from the hide. No one has seen this uniform, but it would fit his public persona. After classifying and settling the planet, a small defence force was left behind, mainly to hold off any orcs tempted to raid this deep into the Crusades' line. Much of their time on planet was spent with very little to do, as the native population was fairly tame and had nothing but love for the god-emperor. Occasionally there would be a small uprising by one of the tribes that had been displaced, when the Astra Militarum claimed certain land as their headquarters. But savages with swords and axes do very little against trained soldiers with laser guns. At the beginning of the year, 815 of the 41st millennium, the small garrison received a rather abrupt wake-up call. Lord Commissar Vance Theron and Battlegroup Cerberus arrived in force to stand in the way of a new Xenos threat that was approaching. When Theron landed, he exited his lander quickly and set up a command post inside the Astra Militarum headquarters for himself and the rest of the triumvirate of officers that commanded the Orpheus Salient. Immediate orders were given to begin erecting defensible positions. Swarms of Adeptus Mechanicus servitors skittered off of the lander in his wake and began stripping the compound of all materials needed to enhance the base's defense. Over the next 2 solar weeks, 33 full regiments of the Astra Militarum, almost the entirety of the Orpheus Salient complement, landed with the scintillant 84th Grenadiers and General Darian Archelius at their head. Artillery pieces were quickly placed in defensible positions. Sentinels and snipers were sent to reconnoitre the surrounding terrain. Lord Commissar Theron barricaded himself in his command post with General Archelius in an attempt to find a way to effectively hold the line at Trajan. It wasn't until the 15th solar day that Theron received 3 communications. The first was from Lord Admiral Anastasia Archelius, saying that if the shadow being cast in the warp was any indication, the Tyranid fleet was massive. The second came from the Dark Suns chapter of Space Marines. The Dark Suns veteran First Company with its squads of Terminators would be arriving in 3 solar days. The third was from his fleet astropath. The Tyranids would arrive in 2 solar days. When the Tyranid Hive fleet arrived, Lord Admiral Archelius proved to any doubters exactly how she had achieved her position. Fully 1/3 of all Tyranid vessels were destroyed in the naval engagement above Trajan. Her fleet was badly damaged, but she was still able to order her picket ships in to provide close fire support for the upcoming ground battle. On the ground, despite the situation in orbit, the task ahead of the 16 million guardsmen seemed hopeless. What appeared to be a monsoon of living monstrosities began pouring out of the sky, and wave upon wave of hungry Xenos beasts rushed towards the Imperial battle lines. For 24 solar hours, the entire planet of Trajan was a battlefield. Millions of Astra Militarum were killed, and even more were wounded. 18 solar hours into the engagement, streaks of light came hurtling toward the planet's surface. Over the communication system came a message telling Lord Commissar Theren to order a full counter-assault in exactly 1 solar hour. Attached to the message were the authorization codes of the Death Watch. Precisely 1 hour later, the Tyrannid horde fell into absolute disarray, and Lord Commissar Theren sent planet-wide orders to begin the counter-assault. 5 solar hours after that, Lord Commissar Theren met up with the Death Watch kill teams that had been inserted on the planet via drop pod. These kill teams had destroyed the largest Tyrannid synapse creatures, thus disrupting the creatures' ability to psychically communicate with one another through the Hive mind. With no enemy leadership in place, the Astra Militarum were able to take advantage of the Tyrannids' confusion and drive them back into an open area where the Imperial fleet in orbit could bombard the Xenos. When compiling his after-action report, General Archelius noted that if the Tyrannids had continued engaging the fleet in orbit, it would have been impossible for the Death Watch to get close enough to be successful. By committing to the all-out attack too early, the Tyrannids had cost themselves the battle. When the Dark Suns arrived the next solar day, they were quickly able to hunt down and remove all obvious signs of Tyrannid infestation. All 3 Astra Militarum commanders were acknowledged for their bravery and skill in handling what would normally have been an impossible situation. The one drawback was that the attacking Tyrannid force had now splintered apart. One splinter fleet moved towards Heathguard, and the other appeared to be heading for Tryphon. The Death Watch are currently keeping a very close eye on Trajan, as they need to make sure that the planet is thoroughly cleansed of the Tyrannid infestation. The bold decision. Fresh from their successful defense of Trajan, the triumvirate of the Orpheus Salient decided that they would now have to make a gamble on their next move. The Tyrannid infestations must be wiped clean from the Jericho Reach, so as not to risk another splinter fleet moving somewhere else and continuing the destruction. Lord Admiral Anastasia Archelius suggested that they concentrate their naval resources into one massive fleet and overwhelm the Tyrannids at every encounter. Her brother General Darian Archelius suggested luring the Xenos to either an uninhabited or sparsely inhabited world and just bombarding them from orbit. Lord Commissar Vance Theren had another idea. Battlegroup Cerberus would swing coreward and skirt the edges of the Orpheus Salient until they had reached the end of the push. At this point they would turn about and begin to give chase after the trailing edges of the Hive fleet. Battlegroup Daedalus would move rimward and skirt the other edge of the salient. They would then hold position until they received acknowledgement that Battlegroup Cerberus were in place. At this point, the 2 Imperial fleets would converge on the Tyrannids and make them pay for the suffering that they had caused the Imperial Crusade. Only time will tell if their plan is successful. Current status. We have begun to encounter some communications difficulties within the salient. These seem linked to activity near the Phonos system. I am personally taking Battlegroup Argo there to identify the issue and get it quickly sorted. I am confident that it is not a matter of serious concern. General Mikhail Kuras, in his last dispatch to the Lord Militant. Imperial forces have continued to analyze Hive fleet Dagon, but any measurement based upon Tyrannid activity is confounded by the shadow in the warp. As the Xenos presence prevents Imperial forces from effective communication, it is likely that additional worlds have fallen to the alien threat without the Achilles Crusade, or even the Death Watch becoming aware of the attacks. Consequently, any analysis that depends upon such data collection must be carefully considered in light of this imposed limitation. Though Herisor was the first world to fall to the Tyrannid threat, attacks upon Freya and Xanatov's harbour also occurred in short order. Timing of these early attacks is difficult to gauge, as there was little contact during the attack, and substantial time may have passed before investigations revealed the Tyrannid activity. Best estimates suggest that all three of these worlds were under assault at the same time. Since these initial attacks, reports have begun pouring in from worlds all across the rimward edge of the Jericho Reach. Much of this information comes from bedraggled survivors who managed to escape on warp-capable vessels just as their worlds were being consumed, and Crusade leadership has struggled to sort through the mountains of contradictory reports. Some headway has been made in stalling the relentless advance of the Hive fleet, but most of it has been due to the efforts of the command triumvirate of the Orpheus salient, who are operating deep within the shadow in the warp. The agents of the Death Watch and the Ordo Xenos have had much more luck than the overwhelmed Crusade leadership. Making use of their array of rapid strike vessels, the Death Watch has sent kill teams into the swarm to collect genetic samples for analysis, scout the Hive fleet's progress into the system, and to strike at high-value targets when the opportunity arises. However, even the elite and well-organized Death Watch Space Marines have difficulty contending with the complete communications blackout imposed by the shadow in the warp. Watch Fortress Erioch will go great lengths of time, hearing nothing from the rimward edge of the Reach, unsure if the watch stations there are even still standing. Based upon the timestamps of various incident reports, Hive Fleet Dagon has no fewer than 3 subfleets. Reports of historical Tyranid strategies suggest that a Hive ship rarely leaves a star system prior to completing the assimilation and destruction of all planets within that system. As there are large-scale attacks currently in progress on no fewer than 9 star systems in the Jericho Reach, Crusade tacticians, including the Lord Militant Solomon Tetrarchus, have been unable to reconcile this broad battlefront with the notion of a limited engagement by a Tyranid splinter fleet. Each of these subfleets requires a separate Hive ship to coordinate its Hive mind. In order to ultimately defeat the Tyranid attack, each subfleet must be eliminated, so that the Hive mind throughout the Reach may be compromised. Until that happens, surviving Hive ships could travel to a contested system, throwing their added might into a battle. Coordinating the battle plan to simultaneously defeat all of these bioships may be impossible while dealing with the limitations of astro-telepathic communication in the presence of the shadow in the warp. Hive Fleet Dagon Tactics. There is no evidence that these so-called Tyranids are a reasoning opponent. The Xenos are surely incapable of using any sort of advanced tactics. Rather, they are little more than an all-consuming organism. Overcoming them should be a simple matter of applying thought and leverage to determine their vulnerabilities. Bishop Joseph Darwin to Inquisitor Kryptman. Because of the limitations imposed by the shadow in the warp, Imperial analysts believe that Hive Fleet Dagon was identified only after it had already completed several successful assaults within the Jericho Reach. As a consequence, it is uncertain whether the Tyranid forces are the spear tip of a much larger force, or if they simply represent the surge in growth that would occur after absorbing the biomass from several of the region's inhabited planets. If these Xenos began their intrusion with a limited force, it may be that the earliest attacks exhibited were undertaken in a conservative manner. Unfortunately for the Achilles Crusade forces, it is clear that the Hive fleet has met with a great deal of success. At this time, the Hive fleet's bioships are generally well supplied with biomass. As a consequence, the Tyranid incursion represents a substantial threat to all other life within the Jericho Reach. These Xenos are capable of exploiting the raw materials that they have captured to launch attacks that utilize near-overwhelming force against prey worlds. With each triumph, their resources are renewed and their capacity for destruction becomes further enhanced. Achilles Crusade and Deathwatch forces have confirmed intrusions by Tyranid Vanguard drone ships within more than 20 star systems of the Orpheus salient. Imperial forces fear, but have not confirmed, that the majority of these intrusions coincide with insertions of gin-stealers or lictors to habitable planets. Imperial analysts have thus far had no luck in tracing a pattern of how Hive Fleet Dagon's Vanguard drone ships have been scouting the Reach. This, combined with a lack of knowledge regarding the lifespan of the Vanguard drone ships, leaves Imperial forces helpless to defend against these forward scouts of the Hive Fleet. If each such creature is capable of identifying and infecting multiple targets, a single vessel surviving could soon draw Hive Fleet elements to dozens of planets. Deathwatch agents are currently monitoring reports that could indicate the earliest stages of Tyrannid scouting activities within more than a dozen star systems. Based upon current data, the Deathwatch believes that this substantially exceeds the number of planets that the Hive fleet is currently capable of engaging. While Deathwatch agents have confirmed Tyrannid activity in all systems that have been attacked by the full might of the Hive fleet, not all systems that exhibited a scouting presence have been attacked. This suggests that the Hive fleet may be plotting out its travel through the Jericho Reach. The Hive mind may be preparing for an extended incursion, carefully selecting which planets might offer the most biomass return, so that environments of less strategic value could be targeted after its resources are better established. When the Tyrannid Hive ships enter a star system, they have consistently demonstrated a specific focus upon immediately assaulting any habitable planets. While this may seem an obvious strategy, it is important to note that Hive Fleet Dagon has largely ignored Imperial void stations and outposts on otherwise barren planets and moons. Imperial vessels have generally only been attacked after they directly engaged the Tyrannid void travelers. It might offer further evidence that the Hive mind is operating in a conservative fashion, or might simply be that for some reason the Hive fleet is unable to accurately identify these elements as worthwhile targets. Once Hive ships enter the orbit of a prey planet, they have consistently begun their attacks by launching vast numbers of mycetic spores towards the world's surface. In the earliest reported instances, this initial attack wave was so numerous that defenders were overwhelmed within solar days. More recently, Crusade forces have successfully survived this initial attack. On the worlds of Castabel, Atonement, and Heathguard, Imperial defenders managed to repel enough of the spores that the battles for control of these planets have become protracted engagements. On Avalos and Trajan, Imperial defenders even managed to repulse the initial Tyrannid attack, causing the void-faring Tyrannid creatures to leave those systems. There are many speculations as to why the Tyrannids fled. Some Imperial analysts believe they moved on to easier prey, while more military minds speculate the creatures are attempting deliberate feints to draw Imperial defenders away from other worlds. If this is the case, it may be that planets further from currently engaged systems could be attacked unexpectedly. The Orpheus salient at present has a very limited number of defenders held in reserve. The vast majority of these are currently deployed upon those planets closest to the Tyrannid incursion. In the event the Hive mind chooses to bypass those planets and instead targets worlds deeper behind enemy lines, the consequences could be catastrophic. Such a tactic might also explain the extensive number of star systems where Tyrannid scouting activity has been confirmed. The potential for this strategy is increased due to the absence of a Tyrannid supply line. Once a Hive ship leaves a system after devouring its habitable planet's biospheres, nothing is left behind. A Hive ship and its support vessels effectively carry all of its swarm into each new war zone. Once a system is engaged, the Hive fleet must triumph quickly, or the vessels possess ever fewer creatures to commit to an attempt to consume an alternative target. While these failed and extended engagements could increase the chance of an ultimate Imperial victory, they might also provide evidence that Hive Fleet Dagon is actually carefully preparing to expend all of its resources upon an unsuspecting target. Morphology. Before we can come to understand the threat presented by Hive Fleet Dagon, we first must come to grips with the organisms that comprise it. Only by studying their ontogeny can we begin to understand their capacity. Brother Codicia Tylon. The Tyrannids of Hive Fleet Dagon are similar to those which were encountered during Hive Fleet Behemoth's assault in the First Tyrannic War. However, additional Tyrannid bioforms have been observed among the forces of Hive Fleet Dagon. There have also been subtle changes within the appearance, but not the tactical role, of some of the previously identified Tyrannid organism strains. These variations have included exoskeletal structures, colorations, and the most commonly observed weapon, biomorph symbiotes, used by the different Tyrannid species. The most distinctive change shown by Hive Fleet Dagon is a variation in the hues of the different Tyrannid creatures. The carapace on specimens from Hive Fleet Behemoth typically ranged from jet black to a deep blue. The unprotected skin of those bioforms was typically a bright red. In contrast, the exoskeletons of Hive Fleet Dagon's bioforms are generally dark grey or a blue, close to that used by the Ultramarines chapter. Where the Xeno's flesh is unprotected, it is a burgundy colour. Weapon symbiotes employed by the various Tyranids also show a substantial change in frequency from those observed during Hive Fleet Behemoth's forays into the Ultima segmentum. Specific instances within commonly encountered creatures are addressed below. Nonetheless, the consensus variants have been shown to be statistically different among parts of Hive Fleet Dagon. As this incursion has been in progress for less than 5 standard years at the time of this report, this may be an anomaly due to the environmental conditions and the defenders present on the worlds that have been invaded to date. This evidence suggests that Hive Fleet Dagon is a distinct entity from Hive Fleet Behemoth, but does not definitively confirm a separation between the two incursions. In addition to biomorph symbiote modifications, the Tyranids found within Hive Fleet Dagon have shown an increased propensity for toxicity. A substantial number of otherwise characteristic Tyranid bioforms have presented with venomous sacs near their claws and fangs. These toxins substantially increase the mortality rate among Imperial casualties within the Orpheus salient. Further, these toxins have shown a substantial range of variation even within planetary environs. Imperial Medicae personnel have been unable to identify an anti-serum that works consistently against the toxins. Distinctive specimens. Several Tyranid variant strains have been observed within Hive Fleet Dagon that are believed to be completely novel. Of these, a few have generated legends and lore among the Imperial forces that oppose them. The Janita Tech Priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus seem unable to discern whether these specimens are specific individuals of their species or entire variant strains. It is, however, clear that these examples are consistent in their tactical approaches and seem capable of learning from past encounters. Some reports indicate that members of these strain variants have returned to the battlefront after being slain in battle. It is unclear if this indicates that the Tyranids have a mechanism for resurrecting these bioforms, or if the later encounters are evidence of additional specimens. Dagon Overlord, first encountered during the brutal warfare on the world of Castabel, this specimen is believed to be a variant of the Hive Tyrant strain. The Dagon Overlord has been identified as active within many of the systems under assault within the Orpheus salient. This monster is known for its malicious streak, and its ability to drive lesser Tyranid strains into an even more hideous fervour than is typically observed. As is often seen amongst Hive Fleet Dagon bioforms, this specimen is exceptionally toxic, constantly dripping with venom. Mist Reaper. First observed on Xi'an, this variant of the Lictor strain has been recently observed on other worlds of the Orpheus salient. The Mist Reaper invariably works alone, generally long before Tyranid forces assault a prey world. This monster is responsible for the deaths of hundreds of Imperial citizens who believed that they were safe, far from any conflict lines. Members of the Ordo Xenos Divisionis Biologis postulate that the creature has a specific knack for overcoming Imperial security measures, though this has not yet been confirmed. What lies beneath? First identified during a Hive city assault on Castabel, this horror is believed to be a variant of the Trigon bioconstruct. Always accompanied by swarms of Hormagaunts, what lies beneath is characterized by attacks upon Imperial structures far from any battle lines. Reports indicate that this Xenos nightmare is capable of burrowing through even the thick fortifications of plasteel and ferrocrete required by the foundation of an Imperial Hive city. Imperial analysts are currently attempting to identify what draws the creature to its targets, so that they might find a means to isolate and eliminate the threat it represents. Hive Fleet Gorgon. Hive Fleet Gorgon was a Tyranid Hive fleet which invaded the Tau Empire in the year 899 of the 41st millennium. The Gorgon was a splinter fleet of Hive Fleet Behemoth that had been founded by those Tyranids who had survived the Behemoth's destruction during the Battle of Macragge, and which began consuming poorly defended Imperial worlds to replenish its small numbers. By the time this splinter fleet made its way into Tau space in the eastern fringe of the galaxy, it had grown to become a full Hive fleet in its own right. Hive fleet Gorgon was relatively small in size compared to the other Hive fleets that assaulted the galaxy, but it was characterized by an extremely rapid rate of adaptation to new weapons and tactics that was astounding even for a species renowned for its ability to direct its own evolution to meet new challenges. In response to the pulse weaponry and long-range tactics of the Tau, the Gorgon's primary strategy was the utilization of smaller and faster-breeding tyrannid organisms to accelerate its evolutionary process. As a consequence of this strategy, the larger tyrannid biomorphs were few in number within the swarms of the Gorgon. Hive Fleet Gorgon was finally destroyed in the year 903 of the 41st millennium at the Battle of Worldspine Ridge on Kelshan by the combined forces of the Tau Firecast and the Astra Militarum. It is possible that this extremely rapid adaptability was an innate characteristic of the Tyrannid strains that comprised Hive Fleet Gorgon. However, the truth may lie in the unusual nature of the Gorgon's foe. The Tau are no less dynamic a species than the Tyrannids, always willing to adapt, though their methods are rooted in the flexibility of their technology rather than biological evolution. The Tau proved to be a very different kind of foe for the Tyrannids, one less hidebound by tradition and doctrine than either the humans of the Imperium of Man or the Eldar of the Craft Worlds. As such, Hive Fleet Gorgon may simply have had to adapt even faster to defeat this new kind of enemy. Adaptations. As the war between the Tau and the Tyrannids progressed across Tau space, both the invaders and the defenders rapidly adjusted to their opponents' tactical shifts. Both sides tested each other for a weakness that could be exploited, whilst preventing their foe from doing likewise. The Tau Supreme Admiral, Korovanen, soon realized that only a fluid strategy that combined the entrapment tactics of the Tau Firecast's ancient Kauyon disciplines with the aggression of the tactics of the Montka could provide victory. But tactical difficulties were just the beginning of Ovanen's troubles, as the Tyranids moved to adapt not just to the Tau's tactics, but to their weapons technology as well. In response to the Tau's pulse rifle technology, the Tyranids restructured their biomorphs' carapaces, dramatically increasing their resistance to the Tau's energy weapons. In response, the Tau reconfigured their weapons to use either new or even older versions of the weaponry that the Tyranids had not before encountered and therefore could not have adapted to. However, each time they faced the Tau in combat, the Tyrannid hive mind adjusted its biomorphs' reproductive matrices to meet the challenge with new phenotypes. During the Gorgon's initial assault on the forest world of Shadrag, the ferocity of the Kroot auxilia commanded by Shassel Vorka was decisive in repelling the Tyranids' first landings, as the Kroot mercenaries proved more than capable of holding the swarms of Hormagaunts at bay. But the hive mind adapted, and the second wave of Hormagaunts to assault the world were noticeably swifter than their predecessors, able to move through the planet's twisted foliage without fear of becoming entangled. Many thousands of Kroot gave their lives to stop this second invasion. When the third invasion of Shadrag inevitably began, the hive mind had altered the Hormagaunts further, increasing the efficiency of the creatures in tearing through the thick hide of the Kroot. Unfortunately, this third wave made quick work of the forest world's Kroot defenders, yet the genetic changes made to the Hormagaunt biomorph weakened the creature's own resistance to injury, as the hive mind had traded thicker carapaces for more powerful musculature and speed. This allowed the Tau, using the time bought by vast quantities of Kroot blood, to blow them apart with their powerful ranged energy weapons. In the end, Hive Fleet Gorgon's extreme adaptability proved to be its chief vulnerability, as the rapid cycle of adaptation and replenishment of its forces forced the Tyranids to rely on their smaller, less complex biomorphs that could be bred most rapidly. The Gorgon had few of the larger and more potent Tyrannid biomorphs at its disposal, and those it did possess were not easy to replace. Once the Tau recognized this reality and made the elimination of these creatures a priority for the Firecast, the course of the war dramatically shifted in their favor. Strange bedfellows. The last weeks of the Tau Empire's campaign against Hive Fleet Gorgon unfolded on the sept world of Kelshan in the year 903 of the 41st millennium. Even as the Tyranids had threatened Tau space, the Tau of Kelshan had already been involved in a war against the 18th Cadian army of the Imperial Guard. Once the Tyranids entered the star system, the commander of the Cadian 18th, Castellan Krask, temporarily ended his battle with the Tau and joined with their forces to shatter the Hive fleet that represented a danger to every living thing on Kelshan. The truce lasted only until the last Hormagaunt was slain, but such was to be expected from the xenophobic forces of the Imperium of Man. While the Gorgon had represented a terrible danger to the Tau Empire, by Imperial standards, this splinter Hive fleet had been only a minor irritant. Krask believed the Tau to be weaklings for having such difficulty in scouring such a small Tyranid force from their space, since he did not realize how far the Tau had already degraded the threat by the time it reached Kelshan. This misunderstanding of the situation was the primary factor in the commencement of the Imperium's Iron Hammer campaign against the Tau, which eventually escalated into the greatest confrontation seen yet between the Imperium and the Tau Empire. Future peril. Despite their victory, the invasion of Tau space by Hive Fleet Gorgon would leave a dark shadow upon the future of the Tau Empire. Just before the Gorgon's final destruction, 3 Hive ships had broken off from the main fleet of bioships and headed back into the intergalactic void beyond the galactic rim, with elements of the Tau Navy in close pursuit. These Hive ships carried within their adaptive genomes the full scope of the Gorgon's experiences in battle with the Tau. The Tau mistakenly believed that this knowledge could only be transferred if these Hive ships survived to make physical contact with other Tyranid Hive fleets that were moving on Tau space. This was not the case, and the Tau were likely to face further incursions from the Great Devourer that would reveal the true scope of the Tyranid threat to all forms of life in the Milky Way galaxy. The Gorgon's course. Assault on the forest world Shadrag. The Tau were first alerted to the arrival of Hive Fleet Gorgon within their space in the year 899 of the 41st millennium, when the worlds of several Imperial trading partners were consumed. Next, all contact was lost with the outbound Brotherhood Tau explorer fleet after it strayed into the path of the ravenous Tyranids. The Tau fleet was consumed so quickly that not a single warning of the coming onslaught managed to escape. It was in late the year 899 of the 41st millennium that the forested colony world of Shadrag's orbital system perimeter outpost was eliminated by a Tyranid assault. The Kelshan Sept fleet, under the command of Koro Valroth, slipped its moorings and headed for Shadrag. In early the year 900 of the 41st millennium, the orbital shipyards on Shadrag's moon were attacked by Hive Fleet Gorgon's outriders. With all other options ruled out, the defenders of the shipyards sealed themselves within their main complex, trusting to their interceptor screens to buy them time. Tens of thousands of Tyranid gargoyles died under Tau interceptor fire. The Tyranids moved on to the forest world of Shadrag, leaving only a handful of bioships to blockade the moon. A new strain of gargoyles then attacked Shadrag's lunar complex. The interceptor screen opened fire once again, but the power of its strikes had been lessened by a new, refractive mucus coating that now covered the gargoyles' chitinous hides. Their primary means of defense lost, the Shadrag lunar shipyards were finally overwhelmed. By the time the Kelshan Sept fleet arrived at Shadrag, it found the world already under full siege by the Gorgon. The Tau fleet breached the Tyranid blockade of the forest world long enough that it was able to deliver fire-cast reinforcements to the world's defenders, but was forced to retreat from direct combat. Koro Valroth ordered hit-and-run attacks to begin on the Hive fleet's perimeter. With his defences bolstered by additional warriors from Kelshan, Shassel Vorka sent his Kroot auxiliaries to create an outer defence line on the surface of Shadrag that will meet the Tyranids' initial ground assault. Late in the year 900 of the 41st millennium, a vast swarm of Tyrannid hormagaunts assaulted the Kroot defensive positions in the great forests of Shadrag. Many of the invaders were entangled by the forest's heavy foliage and undergrowth, or caught in the Kroot's specially prepared traps. Under the command of Shaper Pechalai, the Kroot managed to drive the Tyrannids back from the outer perimeter line. Despite the defeat, in early the year 901 of the 41st millennium, Shaper Pechalai's position was assaulted once more, this time by a modified variant of hormagaunts who had been bred swifter by the Hive mind, and thus were less vulnerable to being ensnared by the forest world's undergrowth or Kroot traps. Only brute force and sheer tenacity allowed the Kroot defenders to hold the line this time. Unfortunately, a final wave of hormagaunts, honed into their final phenotypical forms by the Hive mind, swamped the carefully prepared Kroot defences of Shaper Pechalai. However, following their heavy losses to Tau Fire warriors, the hormagaunts and termagants of the Gorgon developed an almost total immunity to the fire of Tau pulse rifles. The main settlement of Shadrag was finally overrun by the Tyrannids, and Shasel Vorka chose to withdraw his remaining forces into the forest world's mountains. Following this defeat, Tau stealth teams recovered several hundred Kroot rifles from the ruins of Shaper Pechalai's final defensive perimeter. This weaponry was dispersed amongst Shadrag's remaining fire warriors. In orbit of the forest world, fresh broods of hormagaunts and gargoyles were spawned by the Hive fleet with chameleon-like hides that allowed them to completely blend in with their environment. They were now nearly invisible to the naked eye, and only the sensor packages of Tau battlesuits could be relied upon to accurately detect them. Realizing that the situation on Shadrag was now untenable for his forces, Korovanan ordered the Tau fire caste's withdrawal from the forest world, and the Kelshan Sept fleet broke the Tyrannid blockade long enough to retrieve the bulk of the surviving Tau ground forces left on the colony planet. Shasel Vorka refused to abandon hope, and he and his hunter cadre chose to remain on the world under the pretext of covering the Tau retreat, but with the full intention of remaining behind to continue to fight, despite the long odds. In late the year 901 of the 41st millennium, Shasel Vorka initiated a series of high-risk missions that shattered the Tyrannid's web of synapse creatures on Shadrag. The success of this operation drove the Tyrannids of the Gorgon from the forest world, but it proved a Pyrrhic victory, as Shadrag has been almost completely consumed by Ripper swarms. Vorka's hunter cadre abandoned the near-lifeless planet not long after, taking some solace in the fact that they had denied the Tyrannids the entire planet's biomass. The harvest of Kamais. In early the year 902 of the 41st millennium, dozens of Hive ships separated from the main body of Hive fleet Gorgon and descended upon the Tau colony of Kamais. Bitter fighting erupted as a fleet of Necron starships unexpectedly emerged from within Kamais' dead moon, which had been a secret Necron tomb world, its undying inhabitants long sleep, disturbed by the conflict between the Tau and the Tyrannids. The outnumbered Tyrannid bioships were destroyed. This unexpected victory led to a day of celebration amongst the Tau on Kamais. Unfortunately, the Necrons landed a force on the colony world to be greeted in great ceremony by the honoured ethereal Antaniel. The Tau had never encountered the Necrons before, and thus did not realize that the undying machine race represented a threat as great, if not more so, than the Tyrannids. Antaniel was slain by the Necron invaders, who immediately began harvesting all of the Tau on Kamais for their Satan star gods. In response, the Kelshan Sept's ethereal council ordered the evacuation of the remaining Tau colony worlds that lay between Kamais and Kelshan. During the evacuation of the colony planet of Hosan, the fleet was ambushed by Tyrannid prowler drone bioships. More than 300 Tau vessels were lost to the Gorgon in less than 3 hours. A small group of Tau ships escaped to the abandoned mining facilities on the edge of the Hosan system. The survivors tried to fortify the decrepit residential buildings of the mines, but the improvised defences were easily swept away by the Tyrannids that arrived on the planet 2 days later. Not a single Tau survived the massacre of Hosan. In middle of the year 902 of the 41st millennium, the Tau engaged Hive fleet Gorgon in the Battle of the Solai Rift. Kor Ovanan's fleet engaged the Gorgon as it left the Kamai's system. The battle at first went well for the Tau navy, but they were forced to retreat after encountering a cluster of Ramsmiter and Razorfiend bioships that had developed immunity to the Tau's ion weaponry. Before the Tau fleet withdrew, they did succeed in slaughtering many of the Gorgon's narvals, hoping to buy enough time to fortify Kelshan against the Tyrannid onslaught. Not long after the battle at the Solai Rift, the world of Roksh, the home of the Rokshashi Wealthweb merchant guilds, was completely consumed by the Gorgon. Several Tau trading fleets were lost in the Roksh system, including a secret Tau Firecast listening post on Roksh 16. Meanwhile, Valroth's fleet had returned to the Kelshan Sept's orbital shipyards. The fleet underwent major retrofits in an attempt to overcome the Tyrannid's recently developed immunities to ion fire. Victory at Kelshan. An Imperial Navy fleet, sent into the warp more than 150 Terran years before to support the then ongoing Damocles Gulf Crusade, arrived at Kelshan unexpectedly in late the year 902 of the 41st millennium, after being trapped and delayed in an eddy in the Immaterium. Unaware that a Tyrannid Hive fleet was already assaulting the region, the fleet entered orbit of Kelshan and besieged the planet. The commander of the 18th Cadian army of the Imperial Guard that was carried aboard the fleet, Castellan Krask, led his guardsmen in a planetary assault. Valroth's fleet, its modifications completed, left the orbital shipyards and immediately engaged the human besiegers. Not long after the Imperials arrived, the Tyrannids entered the Kelshan system and joined the already ongoing battle in orbit and on the planet below, initiating a short three-way conflict. But faced with a common enemy that represented a terrible danger to them both, Castellan Krask and Koro Valroth agreed to an uneasy truce. Acting in concert, the Imperial and Tau fleets cut deep into the Gorgon's fleet of bioships. Tyrannid casualties proved heavy, and almost all of the bioships were destroyed. In the confusion, 3 Hive ships fled the star system. Korovanan's Tau fleet pursued the Tyrannids, and fleet engaged the surviving Hive ships at the Delmara system. One of the Tyrannid Hive ships was destroyed, but succeeded in luring the Kirshasvra, Castellan-class fleet carrier Firestar, into Delmara's asteroid belt, where it was destroyed. Outnumbered and outgunned, the remaining bioships fled, drawing the Tau even further from Sept worlds that were now left unprotected.